Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. In patch 3.20, 10 different mechanics receive substantial buffs to their Atlas passive tree support. So in this series, I've been looking at all of these different mechanics and discussing the ones that are better, the ones that are a bit weaker. Today we're going to be looking at probably the weakest of the 10 blockable content mechanics, and that is because Ritual's buffs in 3.20 were pretty small. It was not one of the best mechanics in 3.19 either, but it only received very small buffs, whereas mechanics like Legion and Breach in particular were given massive buffs that pushed them far past it. And that said, Ritual does definitely have its charm, and there are definitely people who have a lot of fun with the mechanic. Now, Ritual has a small number of items you can't get anywhere else in the game. The difference between Ritual and, for example, Heist here is that with Heist, there's some very universal things in there. There's a large number of different alternate quality gems that are in demand. There's a large number of replicas, especially Replica Elbron's Warpath, that are in hot demand. Whereas with Ritual, there's Kotra's Regulator, there's Black Flame, there's two other uniques that are seldom used. And that's really it. The accuracy stacking boots, the Blizzard Crowns, these are okay, but they're a lot worse than they used to be. There are accuracy stacking boots and Blizzard Crowns that are available, but these are a lot worse than they used to be. You can no longer get them as item level 86, which really hurts. In fact, they're capped at 83. And also, these items have to compete with Eldritch Implicits, and they really struggle to do that. One thing that needs to be said with Ritual is that a very, very, very large percentage of the loot you get from it will be concentrated in the best 1% or so of rewards, and probably actually less than 1% of those rewards. And that's going to be in the very, very best items you pull. During patch 3.14, which was probably the time that Ritual was the most profitable it's ever been, there was a player who spent 6.5 mirrors buying blood-filled vessels, and then they went and ran 1,000 quad blood-filled vessel maps. Now, there was a bit of Atlas support that no longer exists, so in that version of the game, Ritual was stronger than it is now. However, that person's experience was that they got 7 direct mirror drops, I believe they got 2 headhunter drops, and a whole bunch of other big drops as well. They made a fair bit of currency out of that, although they were investing 6.5 mirrors to get it rolling, so it's certainly something that they'd spent a lot on as well. But it's worth pointing out that the best 10 items that they got was something like 85 or 90% of the entire currency that they got. That was the 7 mirrors, the 2 headhunters, and 1 synthesis ring. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a warning when it comes to Ritual that it is very much chasing those jackpots. The smaller drops don't really add up to much. The one big exception here is actually the heist related drops. You will get some very large stacks of rogue markers out of this, and those things have quite a bit of trade value even if you aren't interested in doing heist yourself. Now, this mechanic is up against the hard left edge of the tree. This encourages you to pair it with Einheart, Blight, Delirium, and or Heist. It's not something you have to pair with those things, they're just the ones that will have the least travel points to get to other mechanics with. However, it doesn't really pair overly well with any of them. It sort of does have some synergy with Delirium, but doesn't really have synergy with any of the others. You're also well placed if you're interested in taking the Synthesis Wheel and or the Shaper and Elder Wheel, so I'll leave that decision up to you. Now, a quick thing needs to be said about blood-filled vessels. These things are far better than they look. So they have the cryptic text, Rituals have 20% improved Favour rewards. Improved rewards is a stat that's ill-defined. The player base doesn't know much of what this does. It's only available in one other place though, and that is on Unrelenting Timeless Emblems, which only give 10%. So if you run a 5-way domain of Unrelenting Timeless Conflict using all 5 different Unrelenting Emblems, then you'll get 50% improved rewards. You can get 80% of this stat if you use 4 blood-filled vessels on a map. Now, it's been my experience that having 80% improved Favour rewards is really, really noticeable. You'll see rarer things will just come up a lot more often. All in all, it's really significant, and it means that you get more shots at those rarest outcomes. Don't know exactly how it works, all I know is that it does do a lot. Higher numbers of monsters on blood-filled vessels is a bonus, but it's not really critical. What's critical is just getting the 20% improved Favour rewards, and also Rituals going faster. That's a really important stat as well, just for quality of life. The other thing you want to watch to make sure is that you don't get any truly terrifying bosses in these. If you have one that's come out of a Vaal Temple that has Kaj ILI in it, if you have one that has one of the Guardians of the Elder or Guardians of the Shaper, or something along those lines, you probably don't want to use that one, except on a map that's got very easy mods, because they can be quite dangerous monsters, especially if they spawn at the same time as a powerful rare monster, and that rare monster is giving the boss an aura of some description. Now we need to quickly talk about rerolls and Favour. There is a whole wheel for these, which we'll talk about in a sec. But just first, generally items almost never seem to cost more than 19,000 in the tribute window. So it's good to reroll if after paying the reroll fee, you will have enough left over to defer a top reward. Remember, we're all about chasing those very rare jackpots. And as a result, it's perfectly fine to say, oh, I've got 2 Chaos Orbs I could take, or I could reroll and see if there's a miracle item. In that case, I would advise you to reroll chasing that miracle drop. You probably won't get it, but the odds of seeing something substantially better than 2 Chaos Orbs are high enough that it ends up being the worthwhile decision. So let's talk about the different clusters that are available. In the southwest corner, we have the Sacred Lands cluster, which provides you with Ritual Chance. Now, this is a cluster that is a completely dead stat if you are always using vessels. On the flip side, if you're never using vessels, it's one of the best clusters on the entire tree for Ritual. Now, if you're in trade, you can skip this cluster, and then in that case, you'll path differently than I have here, and you'll always use vessels instead. That will probably be a better choice. However, if you're not in trade, then you definitely want to take this. It's probably the single best cluster for SSF players. Additionally, you'll notice that you're getting more of this stat on the small nodes. Across the whole tree, there is a total of 50% of this stat. 15% on Sacred Lands, 35% on the small nodes. That means that if you use Wandering Path, which is something that works pretty well with Ritual, then you'll end up with 70% of this stat overall. Next we have the Speed, Vessels, and Sacrificial Due cluster. Now this node itself, completing the final Ritual altar in each of your maps has a 15% chance to drop a Blood-Filled Vessel. If you're in Trade League, Blood-Filled Vessels are pretty much available for 12 to 13 Chaos in general. As a result, this is adding about 2C to every map if and only if you do every ritual in that map. This is not a fantastic node. It is something that's okay, but it's not something that's great, and it's easy to say, I'm just going to skip this cluster. Additionally, you have these 2 increased ritual splinter nodes, which are sort of okay, but again, not all that great. But increased ritual intensity is quite a bit better than it sounds. Ritual altars in your maps can have 20% increased number of monsters spawned at once is a big upside, but 8% faster spawning is even better. This is something that makes rituals run faster in maps, and this is a pretty important section of this cluster. I think there's a good case to be made for just simply taking these points, and then because Sacrificial Due is only 1 point more, you may as well take it, but then ignoring the nodes up the top. This is a reasonable cluster if you're only taking these 4 points, and additionally this cluster becomes even better in conjunction with Wandering Path, because these nodes are just better than the notable is. This cluster is also skippable in its entirety, and you can skip both this cluster and then path very differently through the bottom of the tree in order to catch up to the better nodes. Next we have the West-Northwest Deferral cluster, Answered Appeals. This one's interesting in that it is okay without being extraordinary. Now here you have a situation where the main node, the notable, is more powerful than all of the small nodes put together, but not by very much. So you'll have 5% reduced cost to defer tribute here, and 5% reduced cost on this small node. You get 15% of that stat on Answered Appeal. You'll have deferrals reappearing 20% sooner on 2 of these nodes, and 50% on the big node. So Answered Appeal is basically all 4 of these nodes plus a little bit more. This cluster is okay without being overly great. The reason this cluster is ordinary rather than extraordinary is that if you are someone who is playing a lot of Ritual and speccing Ritual on your tree, you're very likely to have the best node on the tree, Occult Devotion. And that means that you will have more Favour to play around with in maps, and therefore you will be less inclined to defer items than you would be if you were just casually engaging with Ritual with no support on the Atlas passive tree. So for that reason, this is not as good once you are specced thoroughly into Ritual. It's still okay though. There will be times that you will get something that's genuinely really good and that you want to defer it, but that these are not going to be massive jackpots most of the time. And the rare times that you do get a genuine jackpot, like let's say you get a Mage Blood appear in your tribute window, then you can defer that. You've almost certainly got enough tribute available to defer it. And once you've done that, you're just going to be buying 4 Blood-Filled Vessels every map, and you're just going to continue running until you're able to claim that Mage Blood for yourself. As a result, this cluster is okay, but nothing that is particularly great. It's just fine. Next we have the best cluster on the tree, that is Occult Devotion. So your maps with Ritual Altars always have 4 Ritual Altars. This is interesting in that it causes those maps to take longer. However, the payoff is definitely there. This means that you will have an enormous amount of extra tribute, and you'll be able to then spend that tribute in conjunction with the last cluster in order to re-roll your tributes more often, again chasing all of those juicy, juicy, juicy big jackpot outcomes. Now, ritual tribute quantity is a straightforward stat, 5% increased tribute, and you can get 2 lots of that. But then we have this 25% increased chance of ritual altars with special rewards. Sometimes you will find that you will get a special rewards ritual. This will entail every single item that's available being unique, or every single item being a currency item, or every single item being a divination card. If you're playing in solo self-found, the unique one is very good, and so is the currency one. If you're playing in trade, the currency one is quite good, and the divination card one is quite good. In short, these rig the odds in your favour a little bit. Even though there are some things you cannot get in conjunction with one of these special rewards altars, like for instance a 6-linked rare item, you'll find that the overall quality of your rewards is going to improve if you have these nodes allocated. As a result, I highly suggest them. And Occult Devotion is really good, even though it does allow maps to take longer than they otherwise would. Finally, we have the last cluster, which is the Reroll Cluster, and this is an excellent cluster as well. Here we have Flexible Dogma, 18% reduced cost of rerolling favors. This one's okay without being extraordinary, and the small nodes leading up to it are just more of the same stat, but a little bit worse. And then on the other side, we have Profitable Prayers. You can reroll favors 2 additional times. You'll see a lot of synergy here between these two, and also in conjunction with Occult Devotion, like we were saying before. Occult Devotion means you have more favor to spend, and then Profitable Prayers allows you to spend it rolling those dice and chasing those jackpots that end up being such a big part of the loot from rituals. The small nodes here are okay, nothing to write home about, but they're fine. The ones that are on the left-hand side are the weakest. Favors rerolled at ritual altars in your maps have a 0.5% chance not to cost tribute. This is like okay, but it's nothing amazing. As a result, I would generally suggest doing this. Skip this specific node, and you'll be able to pick up everything good on this cluster, but also skip this point, which isn't really worth 1 point. Now, let's talk about the keystones that warp your entire passive tree. Grand Design. No, just no. Do not take this. This is absolutely terrible. It is antithetical to what Ritual does, because Ritual's small nodes are so good. Flip side, Wandering Path. So you have a real cost here. If you allocate Wandering Path, you're going to miss out on Profitable Prayers, which is the biggest cost. You'll also miss out on Flexible Dogma, which isn't that big a deal in conjunction with Profitable Prayers not being there. And you'll miss out on Occult Devotion, but Occult Devotion is also not that big a deal because you don't have Profitable Prayers. That said, some of the other nodes that are small are so good that Wandering Path is actually really good overall with Ritual. If you're interested in doing a Wandering Path tree, you can't really go wrong with Ritual as a mechanic that you base it on. There's just a lot of clusters that get a lot out of this. So definitely give that some thought as a choice. If you do go that way, then of course you're going to be removing all of these notables because they just do absolutely nothing now. But you'll find that you'll still have a lot of very relevant bonuses coming from all of the other nodes on your Atlas passive tree. Anyways, that's all I got on Ritual. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.